So Full Swing is a Netflix series now that follows around pro golfers. And it's amazing to see like what they have to go through from a competitive standpoint. But there was one episode, it was called Imposter Syndrome. And it's about golfer's last name's I think it's Hane. But so they follow on this golfer, his name Hane. He's like maybe like ranked like 146 or something like that in the world, like 146th. And he goes through this like, and I don't want to ruin the whole episode for you, but it's even if you're not a golf, like if you're not into golf, these are like one of those shows, documentaries that like you could relate to, whether it's business, you're a singer, performer, or whatever. It's the trials and tribulations of trying to like reach a high level of performance. And this guy Hane, he talks like extremely negative about himself the entire time. So think of him, he's like 150th in the world, but he constantly talks about how bad he is and that he's not that good. So Mike Duhane, so they have him talking about himself and he's like 150th in the world. And then when you go and you listen to like a Rory McIlroy or like a Brooks Koepka, which are or like a Justin Thomas, who are like top 10. The difference in language in which they use about themselves and their circumstances is like the complete opposite. So Duhane, during this time frame, he has this one time in which he is, in order to get into the U.S. Open, you have to be in top 100. So because he's at 150, he actually has to do an invitational play-in order to even get invited to go play at the PGA Tour. So he has to go do what they call as the longest day in golf, which is 10,000 people that are all trying to get into the PGA Open, the US Open. And there's like 13 slots at the invitational that he's at. So 13 slots. So 13 people can make it out of like a couple hundred that attend this event. And then there's 10,000 people trying to get into, say, this 100 group in order to play. And the US Open is like one of the largest things that you could possibly accomplish. So he's having a terrible round going into it. And then he has to go and do a back, like he then goes into the clubhouse and he actually gets a drink. He has a drink. Like he has like 2 drinks. So they're like, this isn't like you typically wouldn't do this. So he has a couple of drinks. He's talking terrible about himself. And his caddy's sitting there, and his caddy is luckily a super positive guy. And he says, all we got to do is just go ahead and chip away at this. All we got to do is chip away at the challenge that we're going to face. So then they go back out and they have to shoot a -5. He ends up going on the back end of the round and shoots a -5 and has to make a putt in order to get in the US Open. So he barely makes this thing happen, gets into the US Open. So imagine he is at this point where he has to play into the sport in which he's supposed to be professional at. So he has to win this tournament. Then he goes halfway through it, starts getting a drink because he's so depressed, basically, that he can't do it. He's negatively talking about himself. And then positively gets injected with some confidence and momentum from his caddy. So this caddy then, of course, injects that momentum into him. So he goes and then shoots an unbelievable round, one of the best rounds he's had in that year. Gets to the US Open. Then because he's built that momentum, leads the US Open for the first 2 days. So goes in, thinks himself as terrible, goes in, and then goes in the US Open, and now he's leading the US Open for the first 2 days. Now, if you don't know golf, it's like the first 2 days, everybody plays, but then the second 2 days of the weekend is where the field gets cut in half. And then you can now, it's only the qualify first, there's a cutoff, and then you can go ahead and play. So half of them people then play. So he doesn't end up winning the US Open. But what he ends up doing is he ends up coming in like 3rd place or 4th place or something. He shoots like -10 or -10. By the end of that, he gets interviewed. And the interviewer basically asks him something like, hey, now that you've been able to do this, like, how has this now changed like your outlook? And he basically said, like, yeah, now I have the momentum and confidence. I think I'm going to start like trying at this. That's basically what he says. And the reason I wanted to start this conversation with, the kind of that journey is how easily it's for us, even though we're trying to accomplish a goal, how easy it is us to get into negative talk. When we're here, we're competing, we're trying to make something happen. But because we're measuring ourselves to, say, the top 10 players, that we automatically then downgrade and we don't look at the strengths in which we have. We look at the negatives because we're comparing ourselves. So I know how easily that is to happen inside the community. It happens all the time. It's, I'm not as good as this person, or I'm not as good as that person. But the interesting dynamic of that evolution of that story is that it only takes one win in order to completely change the way you talk about yourself, at least for a short period of time, which is like what we tend to see is everybody struggles really hard. They get their first deal. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, now I can actually compete. It's like that Hane make that leap where he's like, I'm terrible. I have to now qualify to be a part of this. And then he ends up qualifying. And then all of a sudden now he's competing at a really high level at that stage. So the way in which we can shortcut this entire process, though, and because Duhane, in my opinion, if you listen to and you watch that episode, his caddy says it every time to him. He says, I've been telling you for 10 years, you're one of the top 10 players. You just don't necessarily get it yet. The way in which we can shortcut this process is if we can put belief and hope into ourselves before we see the results. The hard part is that we tend to want to see the results outside before we convince ourselves inside. Where if we're looking at more hacks on how to move things forward faster, it's if we can create an internal environment that is sharing what we want to accomplish in the long run, it's going to drag your efforts forward. It's going to drag it forward. Because if you believe, like say that golfer, right? If he believed 5 years ago that he could be number one, he would have been a lot closer to number one by now versus him needing to see an outside result, which then increased his confidence to now go ahead and believe he can get to that end goal. So I'm challenging you to make that shift to say, and Tony Robbins talks about this a lot, like almost any of the, especially the old school personal development, they say like you gotta create that vision internally and then speak as if it's already happening.